December 1993. A small radio repair shop in Kigali. The owner, Jean-Marie, is showing his newest acquisition to a friend, a sleek German-made radio receiver. "Listen to how clear it is," he says, turning a dial. A voice emerges from the speaker, smooth and professional. "You are listening to Radio Television Live de Mille Collines, the voice of the people." Jean-Marie smiles proudly. "Beautiful sound quality, isn't it?" His friend nods, but his expression is troubled. "The sound isn't what worries me," he says quietly. "It's what they're saying." Let's freeze this moment. This isn't just about a new radio station. This is about the construction of what scholars would later call the architecture of genocide. That radio in Jean-Marie's shop is not just receiving signals, it is now receiving orders. Those professional voices, they are not just broadcasters, they are architects of mass murder. And that troubled look on his friend's face, that's the recognition that something terrible is being built, piece by piece, right before their eyes. This is part 4 of our series on the Rwandan Genocide. Descent into darkness. You know how they say you can't understand someone until you walk a mile in their shoes? Well, I'd argue you can't understand a nation until you've walked through its history. Not just the highlight reel or the sanitized version you find in textbooks. I mean really getting into its DNA. Those defining moments that shaped everything that came after. Those moments where paths were chosen, where decisions were made in palaces and backrooms and city streets that changed the course of millions of lives. I'm your host, Paul, and this is Double Helix, Blueprint of Nations, where we unravel the genetic code of countries through their most transformative moments. Think of it like ancestry testing, but for entire nations. We dig deep into the historical DNA, finding those crucial moments that made countries who they are today. Over the past 3 episodes, we've been walking through the shadows of history, tracing how a society can be methodically prepared for catastrophe. We've explored the fault lines running through Rwanda's soul, not just the obvious divisions between Hutu and Tutsi, but the deeper fractures, the way colonial powers took fluid social categories and hardened them into racial destiny, how post-independence leaders inherited these toxic ideas and refined them, how generation after generation was taught to see their neighbor not as people, but as abstractions. And you might be wondering, why? Why have we spent so much time in dusty colonial offices, in missionary schools, in the corridors of power where bureaucrats turn identity into weapons? Why have we lingered over seemingly mundane details like census categories and identity cards? Because to understand how a man can wake up one morning, pick up a machete, and walk next door to kill the family he shared meals with for 20 years, or kill his wife, or his children, we need to understand how that morning came to be possible. The genocide of 1994 didn't emerge from nowhere like a sudden storm across Rwanda's 1,000 hills. It grew like a poisonous vine, its roots reaching deep into the soil of society, fed by decades of calculated hatred that watered the cycles of fear and resentment. A moment that captures this transformation is in 1990, in a small village outside of Kigali. A Hutu farmer and his Tutsi neighbors are sharing urwagwa, banana beer, as they've done countless times before. Their children play together in the red dust of the courtyard. Their wives trade recipes and gossip. But something has changed. The radio brings new words, new fears. The newspaper speaks of threats and traitors. And slowly, week by week, the space between these neighbors grows. Shared drinks become less frequent. The children's games take on a darker edge. Words that once meant nothing, cockroach, snake, enemy, begin to carry weight. This is how genocide becomes possible. Not in grand speeches or dramatic declarations, but in the quiet erosion of human bonds. In the way a shared meal becomes a memory. In the way a friend becomes an other. In the way the unthinkable becomes thinkable. Over the next 3.5 years, we'll watch as this poison spreads through every level of Rwandan society. We'll see how the foundation laid by colonialism, which we explored in episode 2, becomes a launching pad for something far more terrible. We'll also witness how the political machinery of the Hutu Republic, which we examined in episode 3, transforms into machinery of mass murder. And we'll see something else. Something that should haunt us all. We'll watch as the world's most powerful nations, the United Nations Security Council, the international community that proudly declare never again after the Holocaust, turned away. Not in ignorance, but in calculated indifference. They'll write reports, they'll hold meetings, they'll use careful diplomatic language that transforms genocide into ethnic tensions and mass murder into civil unrest. What we're about to witness isn't just the story of killers and victims. It's not just about machetes and militias. It's about a society that can be methodically prepared for mass murder, about how ordinary people, teachers, doctors, and priests can become architects of genocide, and about how the world can watch it happen and choose to look away. Today, we are going to unravel how Rwanda transformed from a nation with deep-seated tensions into one primed for genocide. This is not a story about sudden madness or ancient hatreds. This is about the methodical construction of a killing machine, built not with gears and levers, but with words, bureaucracy, and careful planning. Let's start at the beginning. In October 1st, 1990, the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, launches its first invasion from Uganda. Remember those refugees we discussed in episode 3? The ones who fled during the revolution of 1959? Well, their children have grown up, received military training, and decided to fight their way home. This invasion merely served as a catalyst, a trigger, that allowed those who had motive and intent to do their terrible work. Let me explain. President Juvenal Habyarimana had ruled since 1973. His regime, while authoritarian, had maintained a peculiar kind of stability. Yes, Tutsis faced discrimination, but it was a quiet kind. Passed over for jobs, denied educational opportunities, kept out of power. The kind of discrimination that doesn't make headlines, but slowly strangles a community. But by 1990, Habyarimana's grip was slipping. A global coffee price collapse had devastated Rwanda's economy. The World Bank's structural adjustment program had forced austerity measures. Civil servants hadn't been paid in months. In the countryside, young Hutu men were becoming increasingly angry about land shortages and lack of opportunity. This was the powder keg into which the RPF invasion sparked. The invasion also had a secondary effect. It triggered a movement that could trace its roots back to the Parmehutu in the late 50s and early 60s, and onto the Belgian calipers and classification cards that humiliated and oppressed Hutu on behalf of the Tutsis for generations. That movement had a name: Hutu Power. The story of Hutu Power demands our close attention, not just as a historical phenomenon, but as a blueprint for how ordinary grievances can be transformed into murderous ideology. Let me take you inside this transformation. Picture a small bar in Gisenyi in 1991. A group of men are gathered around a radio, listening to news about another RPF advance. They're civil servants, teachers, small business owners, the kind of people you find in any middle-class neighborhood. But listen to how they talk about their problems. Economic hardship becomes evidence of Tutsi manipulation of the banks. Job competition becomes proof of demographic replacement. They're taking our jobs. Every social challenge, every personal setback gets woven into a narrative of victimhood and revenge. This is how Hutu power worked, not just as a political ideology, but as a lens through which to view the world. It offered what extremist movements always offer: simple answers to complex problems, a clear enemy, a promise of restoration. Make Rwanda great again. That wasn't their slogan, but could have been. Let me take you to a moment that captures this transformation. We're in the editorial office of Kangura in early 1992. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the sound of typewriters. Hassan Ngezi, the paper's editor, is reviewing the latest issue. Notice how he structures his arguments. He starts with legitimate grievances. There's economic hardship, social change, and political uncertainty. Then, he weaves this into a narrative of betrayal and threat. Every problem has the same source. Every solution requires the same response. The genius of Hutu power, and I use that word with all of the moral horror I can muster, was how it merged traditional prejudice with modern grievance. It wasn't just about ethnic hatred. It was about preserving traditional values. It wasn't just about killing Tutsis. It was about protecting our way of life. It spoke of demographic threats, of cultural preservation, in language that would sound eerily familiar to any observer of modern extremist movements. But what made Hutu power particularly effective was its ability to present itself as reasonable, even moderate. Its intellectuals wrote scholarly papers about historical grievances. Its politicians spoke of majority rights and democratic principles. They weren't calling for genocide, at least not yet. They were just asking questions, raising concerns, and suggesting that maybe, just maybe, Rwanda's problems had a single source and a single solution. In December 1992, Ferdinand Nahimana, a historian trained at Sorbonne, gives a speech that perfectly encapsulates the approach. We're not speaking of hatred, he declares. We're speaking of history. We're not calling for violence, we're calling for justice. The crowds nod. This sounds reasonable. This sounds academic. This sounds like something you might hear in any political rally anywhere in the world. But watch what happens next. The reasonable facade begins to crack. And what does history tell us? Nahimana continues, his voice hardening. That every time we trusted them, they betrayed us. Every time we showed mercy, they took advantage. Every time we extended our hand in friendship, they reached for our throat. This is how genocide becomes thinkable. Not through crude hatred, but through a carefully constructed worldview where violence becomes not just acceptable, but necessary. Not through wild-eyed fanatics, but through intellectuals who can make mass murder sound like self-defense. At a meeting, just days after the invasion, the first foundational stone of the coming genocide would be laid, and fueled by Hutu power. We're in a government office in Kigali. Colonel Teostene Bagosora, a military officer with a reputation for efficiency, is meeting with a group of politicians and media figures. They're not discussing military strategy, though. They're discussing what they call civil defense. On the surface, it sounds reasonable, protecting civilians from a rebel invasion. But let's look closer at their plans. The first move was the creation of a newspaper called Kangura, or Wake Up in Kinyarwanda. But this wasn't just another newspaper lunch. Remember in episode 2, we talked about early revolutionaries in Rwanda's history. Well, Kangura was designed to play a similar role, but this time in the service of genocide. Hassan Ngezi, Kangura's editor, was a fascinating and terrible figure. He was a former street vendor who taught himself journalism. He combined raw talent with raw hatred. Under his leadership, Kangura didn't just report the news, it created an alternative reality. It published fabricated evidence of Tutsi plots. It ran cartoons depicting Tutsis as cockroaches and snakes. It printed lists of Tutsis and moderate Hutus who needed to be dealt with. By December 1990, Kangura published what would become its most infamous document, the Hutu 10 Commandments. This wasn't just hate speech. It was a blueprint for genocide disguised as religious doctrine. It declared that any Hutu who married a Tutsi woman was a traitor, that any Hutu who engaged in business with a Tutsi was a traitor, that the education system, the military, and the business sector must be Hutu only. But what made Kangura truly dangerous wasn't his crude hatred. It was its sophistication. It quoted philosophers and historians. It used academic language to justify genocide. It turned ethnic hatred into intellectual discourse. Next, a genocide could not be carried without loyal foot soldiers, those willing to die for the cause. Think of Nazi Germany's SS or the separatist armies of the Serbian Republic during the genocide. The army was too small and too professional. Some officers might balk at mass murder. The police were too visible. They needed something new, a force that could operate in the shadows but emerge quickly when needed. Enter the Interahamwe. The name means those who work together, a seemingly innocuous phrase that would become synonymous with genocide. To understand how a youth movement became a killing machine, we need to look at the men who created it. Let me take you to a planning meeting in early 1992. We're in the MRND party headquarters in Kigali. Around the table sit some fascinating characters. There's Robert Kajuga, who would become the Interahamwe's president, a Tutsi himself, proving that the machinery of genocide could accommodate even apparent contradictions. There's George Rutaganda, a wealthy businessman who saw genocide as a market opportunity. And then there is Colonel Teostene Bagosora, watching from the shadows, seeing his plans take shape, the architect of genocide himself. The Interahamwe didn't start as a killing machine. It began as a youth wing of President Habyarimana's political party, the MRND. Think of it like a political youth movement. They held rallies, wore uniforms, and sang party songs, kind of like the Boy Scouts. But under the guidance of people like Robert Kajuga, its president, and George Rutaganda, its vice president, it gradually transformed into something far more sinister. The Interahamwe's evolution from youth movement to killing machine happened with terrifying efficiency. By mid-1992, they had established a clear organizational structure. Each neighborhood in Kigali had its unit. Each sector had its leader. They held regular meetings that looked on the surface like any youth group gathering. Sports events, community service, political rallies. But watch how their seemingly innocent activities transform. A football match becomes a training in group coordination. A community cleanup project becomes practice for setting up roadblocks. Political songs become rehearsals for killing chants. All of this was happening in plain sight, while international observers wrote reports about vibrant youth political engagement in Rwanda. On a Saturday morning in September 1992, at a football field in the Nyamirambo district of Kigali, the Interahamwe are organizing what they call a community sports day. But look closer. The young men playing football are being observed by military officers. They're being evaluated not for their athletic skill, but for their potential as killers. We looked for the ones who could follow orders, a former trainer later testified. The ones who didn't ask questions. The ones who showed enthusiasm. But the Interahamwe needed more than just willing recruits. They needed resources. This is where the economic dimension of genocide becomes crucial. Remember that economic crisis we mentioned? Well, by 1992, Rwanda's economy was in a freefall. Coffee prices, the backbone of Rwanda's export economy, had collapsed. The International Monetary Fund's structural adjustment programs had forced massive government cutbacks. For many young Hutu men, joining the Interahamwe offered an economic lifeline. They received stipends, access to black market goods, promises of looted property. A former member later explained, "They told us we would get the Tutsis' houses, their cars, their businesses. They made genocide sound like an economic opportunity." 2 episodes ago, we said we will have more to say about the Catholic Church, and here's one of those instances. They enter our story not as a restraining moral force, but as an enabler of what was to come. In late 1992, the Church, which had helped construct ethnic identities during colonialism, now helped normalize their weaponization. When Kangura published his Hutu Ten Commandments, several prominent priests publicly endorsed them, giving genocidal ideology a veneer of religious legitimacy. Let me take you to a scene that captures this moral collapse. It's Sunday Mass in a parish outside of Kigali, early 1993. The priest is giving what seems like a normal sermon about community and solidarity. But listen carefully to his words. He says, "We must be vigilant against those who would destroy our unity." He never says Tutsi, but everyone knows what he means. The machinery of genocide was being blessed right there at the altar. For its next act, the importance of mass media as a conduit and an enabler of mass delusion also played its role in Rwanda. Perhaps one of the most infamous elements of the Rwandan genocide was the radio station. RTLM, Radio Télévision Livre des Mille Collines, Free Radio Television of the Thousand Hills. Created in 1993, it wasn't just another radio station. It was designed to be the command center for genocide. The story of RTLM is, in many ways, the story of genocide itself. How something seemingly ordinary becomes lethal. When it first went on air in July 1993, it looked like just any other private radio station. Its offices were in a respectable neighborhood of Kigali. Its employees were educated professionals, teachers, journalists, academics. It played popular music, hosted call-in shows, told jokes. Inside RTLM studios in August 1993, the morning show host, Kantano Habimana, is taking calls from listeners. He's charming, witty, plays the latest hits. Listen carefully to how he frames the news. Another RPF attack in the north. They never rest, do they, these cockroaches? A joke, a song, and then some more poison. A listener called in to report suspicious activities in Gatsata sector. Keep watching your neighbors, friends. What made RTLM so effective was its intimacy. State radio was formal and distant. RTLM was your friend, your neighbor, chatting over the garden fence, just chatting about who should live and who should die. In the United Nations offices in New York, reports about RTLM's broadcasts were being filed and forgotten. A Belgian diplomat wrote, "Rising concerns about inflammatory radio content." A UNAMIR officer reported, "Radio station potentially contributing to ethnic tensions." The bureaucratic understatements would be almost comical if it wasn't so tragic. Let me show you how this played out in real time. It is November 1993. RTLM broadcast the names and addresses of suspected RPF accomplices. Within days, 2 of them are found dead. The UN response? A diplomatic note expressing concern about media responsibility. Again, in December 1993, RTLM begins airing songs calling for Hutu solidarity against Tutsi threats. The international response? A workshop on media ethics in the conflict zones. The evolution of RTLM's broadcast tells us everything about how genocide became normalized. Early shows mixed entertainment with subtle prejudice. By late 1993, the hatred was more overt, but still wrapped in jokes and popular music. And always, Always, they were building their audience, creating a community of listeners who would later become a community of killers. Here's a chilling detail. RTLM didn't just broadcast hate. It created a participatory atmosphere of genocide. They had call-in shows where listeners reported on their Tutsi neighbors. They had contests for the best security slogans. They made genocide feel like a community project. Meanwhile, the international community was engaged in what can only be described as a masterclass in willful blindness. In January 1993, a top-level international human rights delegation visits Rwanda. They heard RTLM's broadcast. They read Kangura's articles. The report warned of potential genocide. But in the antiseptic language of diplomacy, even this stark warning lost its urgency. At a conference room at the United Nations in New York in March of 1993, a Belgian diplomat is presenting Rwanda's latest human rights reports. There are concerning indications of ethnic tension, he says, shuffling his papers. In the back of the room, the junior official who's just returned from Rwanda raises his hand. Sir, he says, they're not tensions, they're preparations. His concern is noted. The meeting moves on. The machinery of genocide didn't just rely on machetes and militias. It needed international indifference. This is the fourth element. And through a combination of diplomatic protocol, bureaucratic inertia, and cowardice, it got exactly what it wanted. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Rwanda's descent into genocide was how it reshaped everyday economic and social relations. By late 1993, businesses were increasingly operating along ethnic lines. Bank loans were quietly denied to Tutsis. Property sales were informally restricted. The machinery of genocide was being built right into the economy. By early 1994, these various strands, the militias, the media, the economic pressure, the international negligence, were being woven together into what one scholar would later call the most efficient killing machine in modern African history. The abyss to which Rwanda was headed was not inevitable. A more robust response from the international community may have stemmed the tide. In January 1994, in the office of Romeo Dallaire, commander of the UN peacekeeping forces in Rwanda, he receives an intelligence brief about weapons storage, about lists of Tutsis marked for death, about plans for systematic killing. He drafts a cable to UN headquarters. The response he receives is a study in diplomatic paralysis. Do not exceed your mandate. Avoid actions that might require force. Maintain strict neutrality. Dallaire would later write, "My force was willing to take risks to prevent genocide, but New York wouldn't even let us take names." The international community's failure wasn't just bureaucratic. It was in their imagination. They simply couldn't or wouldn't imagine what was coming. Even as RTLM's broadcast became more explicitly genocidal, diplomats clung to the language of ethnic tensions and civil conflict. By March 1994, RTLM had become what one scholar would later call a genocide DJ booth. Between pop songs and weather reports, they were now broadcasting detailed instructions: which neighborhoods to watch, which roads to guard, which families to visit. They had created their own lexicon where ordinary words meant murder. Work meant killing. Tools meant weapons. Cleaning the brush meant eliminating Tutsi families. Security meant genocide. The international community, all this time, was busy with what it called peace process support. The Arusha Accords were being praised as a diplomatic triumph, even as RTLM was teaching its listeners how to recognize Tutsi features as roadblocks. The Arusha Accords, signed in August of 1993, were seen by the international community as a triumph of diplomacy. They mandated power sharing between Hutus and Tutsis, the integration of the RPF into the National Army, and the return of refugees. But for extremists like Bagasora, there was something entirely different: a deadline for action. Every provision of the Accords became a trigger for acceleration. Power sharing? The list of targets were updated. Integration of armies. Weapons were distributed to militias. Return of refugees? Training of the killers intensified. This is what made the Rwandan genocide unique in modern history. It was perhaps the most carefully planned, most bureaucratically organized mass murder since the Holocaust. But unlike the Nazi genocide, which relied heavily on the machinery of a modern military state, the Rwandan genocide was designed to be carried out by ordinary citizens against their neighbors. By March 1994, the machinery was almost complete. RTLM had refined its coding system for broadcasting killing orders. The Interahamwe had organized into neighborhood units. Weapons had been distributed under the guise of civil defense. Lists had been updated and distributed. Administrative systems had been repurposed for genocide, and the international community had been effectively neutralized. All that was needed was a final signal to begin. Before we go, here's a final moment. It is April 6, 1994, early evening. A teacher, we'll call her Marie, is grading papers in her home outside Kigali. Among them is an essay from one of her brightest students. The topic, Rwanda's future. As she reads, her hands begin to shake. The language is familiar. The same phrases she's been hearing on RTLM. The same coded words from Kangura. This isn't propaganda anymore. This is a child's homework. The machinery of genocide hasn't just infiltrated institutions, it has seeped into the minds of the next generation. Outside of her window, the sun is setting on Rwanda. In a few hours, a plane carrying President Habyarimana will fall from the sky, and with it, any chance of preventing what's to come. The machinery built over these 4 years will spring to life with terrifying efficiency. Next time, on Double Helix, a plane crashes in Kigali, and the machinery of genocide roars to life. Radio broadcasts shift from coded messages to direct commands. The Interahamwe transformed from a militia into an army of genocidaires. And the international community, which failed to prevent what was coming, now abandons Rwanda to its fate. Join us for Episode 5 for the roughly 100 days into which Rwanda descends into the depths of hell. The story of how those years of preparation became 3 months of genocide, and how the world chose to look away, is next. Until then, thank you for listening. We will see you next time.